I want to ask you a question. What principles do you live by? What values guide your life? Principles are an important concept. Principles are the building blocks of who you are. Principles give you a guide to follow. Some of you may have grown up in families where certain principles were really drilled down into you, were really taught to you to be important. Whether it's living by your faith, respecting your elders, always telling the truth, working hard, those principles make you who you are. Well, the same thing applies to government. Our government was built on certain principles. Principles like popular sovereignty, like limited government, like separation of powers. So in this lesson, we're going to break down the principles of American government. And we're going to be doing that right now. Before you build a house, you have to lay a foundation. And if that foundation isn't strong, then the house will crumble. Same thing with a government. If your government is built on unstable principles, on an unstable foundation, then that government won't work. That government won't last. Or that government could become corrupt. All right, let's start with popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty comes from two words: popular, meaning people, like population, and sovereignty, meaning power. So you put them together, you've got people power, the power of the people. So this is one of the main principles of any democratic style of government, including ours. So the power of the government comes from the people. We see this echoed in documents like the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson said,
"Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed."
The consent of the governed refers to the people. The people created the government. Therefore, the government's primary job, is to protect the people. Popular sovereignty. Well, how do we know popular sovereignty exists in our government? How do we see it? What does it look like? You see popular sovereignty every time we go out and vote. Every time you see people in the streets protesting. Every time you see a petition come across your social media. Those are ways that we exercise our popular sovereignty, our power of the people. Limited government. So our next principle we want to talk about is limited government. You think about the word limit. Limit means to restrict or to place restrictions on something. When our founding fathers were creating our government, they wanted to make sure that its power was limited. Think back to what happened during the Revolution. What happened between the colonies and the British. The colonists felt that the power of the British government was unlimited, became abusive, tyrannical. Well, we didn't want that to happen in America. So when we created our government, we wanted to make sure that its power was limited. Limited government means that the people are freer and the people's rights can be more protected. So how do we do that? Well, first, when we created the Constitution, we clearly defined the powers of government. And there are many people that believe that the government shouldn't exercise powers that aren't actually written down in that Constitution. We call those people strict constructionists. Let's look at what's happening now. Does the government have a right to tell you to wear a mask in public? Does the government have the power to shut down businesses during the pandemic? All of these questions have to be answered. And not everyone agrees. When our founding fathers were creating the Constitution, one of the major debates that came up was over the addition of a Bill of Rights. Federalists and anti-federalists argued whether or not a Bill of Rights was necessary. But in the end, the Bill of Rights was added, and that's another layer of protection that we have, limiting the government's power. But what happens when certain actors, certain parts of the government, tried to expand their power beyond what the law allows? That brings us to our next principle, the rule of law. The rule of law is a principle that dates back to the time of the Magna Carta in 1215, where nobles placed limits on the power of the king, and the king had to acknowledge that there were laws that even he had to obey. So when we talk about the rule of law, we basically mean that no person, no part of government is above the law. Everyone is subject to the law. That's because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We're not ruled by people, we're ruled by the law. Got it? That brings me to my next principle, separation of powers. The Constitution specifically lays out certain powers for each branch of government. Let's review those branches. First branch is called the legislative branch. It's the branch in charge of making the laws. It consists of Congress, which is made up of a House of Representatives and a Senate. Then you have the executive branch, whose job is to enforce the law or carry out the law. They're headed by the president and vice president. And there's also millions of federal employees known as the bureaucracy that help the president carry out the law. Then there's the judicial branch, which is headed by a Supreme Court. And then there's a layer of appellate courts and a layer of district courts underneath the Supreme Court. The job of the judicial branch is to try cases and to ultimately interpret the laws that are created. Founding fathers like James Madison knew that in order to protect the people and to have good government, you wanted to divide the power amongst branches. Closely related to separation of powers is the principle of checks and balances. So now that we've set up our three branches, another way to ensure that the government doesn't become too large and too powerful is to allow those branches to check and balance each other's power. Check basically means to limit. So each branch can limit the other branch's power, ultimately keeping the people safe. For example, Congress has the power to make laws, but what if those laws are bad laws or laws that trample the rights of people? The president can veto that law passed by Congress. Well, the Supreme Court, which is part of the judicial branch, can ultimately overrule that law using its power of judicial review, nullifying that law and ultimately protecting the people. We want a government that's going to do its job, but at the same time, we want to protect the people. How about the president? What if the president's violating the law? That's where Congress comes in. Congress has the power to impeach, which is done by the House, and to remove a president, which is done by the Senate. If that president is convicted, we've had 3 presidents to be impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. None of those presidents were convicted by the Senate, so none of them were removed. One president, Richard Nixon, resigned after what is called the Watergate scandal. The last principle we want to look at is called federalism. When the founding fathers created our first system of American government under the Articles of Confederation and ultimately the Constitution, they wanted to make sure that the states retained most of their power. They didn't want to create a large national government that would become so big and so oppressive that it would trample the rights of the people and the states. They wanted to give the federal government specific powers and reserve most of the power to the states. That's what federalism is. We call our system a federal system. We have a strong national government. Then we have our 50 state governments. And even beneath that, we have thousands of county, city, and town governments. Typically, we call these local governments. There are certain things that we know the federal government can do. They use the military to protect the country from foreign invasion. They run the postal system. They make trade deals with other countries, regulate interstate commerce, and maintain a system of national parks and land. What about the states? What's their role? What powers do they have? State governments typically handle issues that are isolated within their states, like issues with commerce within the state. Local stores and restaurants have to comply with state and local laws. Otherwise, they might be shut down. A lot of things that you deal with every day are handled by your state and local governments. Things like school. Think about what's happening right now. States are trying to figure out what to do about schools. It's not the role of the national government to decide what to do, but it's up to each individual state to make a decision about how they want to open school. Some states are deciding to send students back full-time to school. Some states are deciding to send students back virtually. And some states are coming up with a plan to utilize both in-person and virtual learning. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the state and local governments to figure that out. When it comes to education, that's one area where state and local governments have a lot of autonomy. Local governments like Guilford County and Greensboro handle handle those issues that affect us on a daily basis, whether it's local traffic laws, issues involving police and fire departments, trash pickup. Every time you go to a local park, you know that your local government is hard at work. So let's review.
The recap.
Number one, principles are the ideas and the values that our founding fathers used to lay the foundation for our American system of government. When they were creating the government, they had these principles in mind that helped them to build a strong government that didn't have too much power and ultimately serve the people. Number two, those principles include popular sovereignty, limited government, the rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. And number three, each of these principles plays an important role in American government. You should be able to see each of these principles in action on a daily basis, but you've got to be paying attention. These principles help to keep the government from becoming too powerful, and at the same time, they're protecting the rights of the people. Now, our government is far from perfect. Because of politics, we're not always going to agree on whether or not the government is living up to these principles. But as long as we stay engaged and participate, then we still have a chance to change our government for the better.
Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us.
As always, thanks for watching.